trust in his agency? Who is going to carry out the transformations that would make permanent revolution a reality in countries like Egypt and Tunisia?
Most recently we've had the student protests, and I think these really have marked a bit of a shift. That not only that hundreds of thousands of young people have come onto the streets for the first time, fighting for their futures and against the government, but the vilification by the police and by the government, and also joined in by the media, has been an absolutely key point here. We've had Alfie Meadows hospitalised, having life-saving brain surgery after being hit over the head by the police, a charge they continue to deny, and in response to his complaint, they have said that he is guilty of violent disorder and are currently putting him through the courts. We've had Jodie McIntyre, an activist who was pulled repeatedly from his wheelchair, filmed again, YouTube, gone everywhere. They say that they're not guilty of anything wrong. Not only have they attacked people on the streets, but they're also putting people through the courts on charges of violent disorder, of assaulting police officers and so on. But even in recent years, I'd like to argue this isn't even something particularly new. And I think the most recent shift happened on quite a small demonstration in 2008 when George Bush, the then President of the United States, came to visit London. Previously, when George Bush came to visit, people were allowed to protest, they marched past Downing Street and so on. This time, the police built barricades either at the end of Whitehall and said, "You're not coming through." Rightly, I was on that demonstration and I'm sure some other people were. People went to stand at the cordon and say, "We think that we should be allowed through." And this was the first time during this, the huge anti-war movement where the police got out their batons and really started cracking heads, and people were put through the courts and paid very heavy fines for that, on that demonstration. But then there was the huge assault of Israel's assault on Gaza in late 2008, 2009. And what these demonstrations against Israel's assault saw was a re-emergence of the Muslim community coming back onto the streets after the huge repression of the stop and search laws, of the anti-terror legislation that really terrified people to stay off the streets. But this assault was too much for those people, and they came out joined, of course, by lots of other black and white people. And the level of brutality on those demonstrations was absolutely huge, but it didn't receive the same amount of publicity that other ones has, particularly because of the large Muslim makeup of those demonstrations and a criminalisation of the Muslim community in Britain. People were sentenced for up to 2.5 years. One person was sentenced, a 17-year-old guy was sentenced for 2 years for throwing a plastic bottle at police lines and never even hit their shields. So this really, I think, was a recent turning point. And of course we had the G20 demonstrations where Ian Tomlinson was murdered by the police, and I think we should be very brave and we should say that openly, that he was murdered by the police. Simon Harwood will now stand charges of manslaughter. Whether he will be convicted or not really is down to the corrupt state that we live under, really. And people are right to be shocked, and I don't think we should ever be complacent to say they're there to intimidate us, but this never works, because sometimes it does work, and I don't think we should be ashamed to say that either, really, that it is scary to see the way that they act to repress these protests. And it's led some people to believe that the police are all powerful and that they can always crush us. But looking back through history, these tactics have appeared time and time again as a way for the ruling class to show who controls the streets and the people that it exploits. And struggle goes up and down, doesn't it? Sometimes it feels like very little's happening and we're intervening in quite small things. And then suddenly, like the year that we've had in 2011, there's solidarity protests for Egypt, there was the strikes yesterday, there was the TUC demonstration, the students and so on. There's a huge explosion of struggle. And I think what we can show is that as struggle goes up, the state starts to re-emerge as something that is very repressive, really. But there is this constant tension, and it also indicates that not necessarily that we're winning, but that we're fighting, that we're putting ourselves out on the streets and saying that they're ours. But police harassment and surveillance are not just aimed at protests. It's not something unique that people that overtly fight against the system do, really. Workers on strike, for example, have often experienced this repression. And ordinary people, the legacy of stop and search, of the sus laws and all of those kind of things, all go hand in hand. And this, obviously, is not something that is mirrored for the rich and the powerful. While ordinary people are harassed, the rich and the powerful, you think about white-collar crime, you think about corruption that costs economies across the world millions and millions and millions of pounds, more than smashed windows and stolen cars, practically remains untouched. But I'd like to point to a couple of examples which I think are quite interesting historically and also give us a bit of strength that we're not on our own. I want to give an example of, in 1889, all the way back when dockers went on strike in Liverpool, they went on indefinite strike. It was an incredibly militant strike, and they basically brought the city and the ports to a standstill. And the army sailed warships off the coast of the docks and pointed their barrels towards the strikers in order to intimidate them. This was accompanied with the army and the police marching through the streets. And we saw something again in 1984-85 in the miners' strike, which tore whole communities apart as people came to fight for their jobs and to fight for their communities. And the attacks of police, not only did they, attack the picket lines and so on, but basically they laid whole villages and whole towns under siege. There was checkpoints, people were pulled over in their cars, things were, that people's cars were sabotaged, people had their brake leads cut by the police. I mean, huge levels of repression trying to crush that strike. And even more recently, last year in London, we had the firefighters strike, the firefighters FBU union, who went on strike, and it was the first time for a long time we've seen militant picketing. People, of course, always stop and have conversations and try and, like we saw yesterday, people not to come out. But on that firefighter strike, there was this one hub in Southwark in South London where a private company were running fire engines in and out. And the firefighters decided that they'd shut down all the fire stations and no one was going to go in because the strike was absolutely solid. So they went down, they blocked the road, they stood in the road and they linked arms and so on. And it wasn't that the scabs drove through that line, it was that the police pulled those people out of the road in order to let the scabs through, really. So I think those examples are quite interesting because it shows that this is the normal function of the state. And as a Marxist, I see that policing is always political. And whether it's spending thousands of pounds protecting the Prime Minister or harassing black people on the streets, this is part of the agenda under capitalism. And it's also important to say that no new organisations are being set up that wrestle control over other sections of the state. It's not like we've got less MPs and more very powerful police officers. There isn't that balance hasn't shifted. And of course we have to fight every expansion of state power. We also have to understand that why the state in general is not neutral, not just in relation to crime and resistance, and why these elements of the state, why the elements of the police and all those kind of things are knitted into the fabric of very much what it is. And at these explosions of struggle, it really can feel like the gloves are off, that there's nothing that we can do. But on a daily basis, the state has things in control to make sure that they control the society that we live in. They have to protect private property, don't they? They have to make sure that workers continue to work so that they can generate profit. So if you agree with this, it becomes clear why it's so important for them to get workers back to work, and why it's so important that you don't just have the police harassing workers on strike or on demonstrations, but you also have all the stuff from the government and from the media and everything else that says it's pointless to go on strike, these people are ruining our society and so on. And so the forces of economy, the forces of profit that drive capitalism forward are much wider than kind of cop versus miner, cop versus striker, or even cop versus Muslim, as we've seen more recently during the war on terror. They have to protect this very system that we live under, the system of advanced capitalism, really. And while for some of us it can seem like we're really under the cosh all the time, there are different ideas in other people's heads, of people outside the kind of core of struggle, if you like. And the state thrives on appearing like it's a neutral thing, doesn't it? And the police are there to protect us, that the courts are there to do everything for us. And these things are, of course, constantly undermined. And people hold two ideas in their heads. Bad things do happen in society. Houses get broken into, people get attacked. So we have to have something that does that. But at the same time, especially when you have cases like Ian Tomlinson, but also just the day-to-day reality of people's lives, when they don't really trust the police either. So there are these two contradictory ideas, sets of ideas in people's heads, really. But the revolutionaries Karl Marx and his collaborator Friedrich Engels presented a different picture of the state, to one that is based, on being like a neutral force, which is what our rulers want us to believe. This was developed by Vladimir Lenin, who's one of the leaders of the Russian Revolution, and I think if people are interested in developing these ideas further, they should read State and Revolution by Lenin, which is really when, in the heat of the struggle, he is grappling with all these different ideas, really. And Lenin, because he was at the centre of this huge upturn, he was constantly confronted with the question of the state, and he was engaged with workers about talking about how they're going to take power. And this study and analysis shows that the state hasn't always existed. It emerged out of a certain point of human history, and it reflected the fact that a group of people, the ruling class, began to exploit the vast majority and live off their labour. So this little corner here, you're going to be the ruling class for the rest of the meeting. I hope you enjoy yourselves. Your time is short-lived.
Depends how big our police force is.
Certainly not, I would like to say. So that's what you want. If you were just this little corner of society and you had all these other people, you relied on all these other people to go to work. You relied on, and all these people are much bigger than you and much stronger than you, and there's many more of them than you. So what would you have to do? You'd have to make sure that you build little turrets around yourselves to make sure that you were protected. So you're living off that labour, and so the state emerged out of these class tensions of the massive ordinary people working to provide the wealth that the small minority live off, really. And so the core of this state is very centralised, isn't it? And it's an unelected body. We don't know who these people are. No one ever voted for them. We don't know who the heads of the police are, the heads of the civil servants, and all those kind of people. And they exert a pressure over our lives. These top police officers and judges and all these other people, they go to the same schools, the same universities, you know, they go to the same dinner parties and all of these kind of things. And you look at the cabinet now, a cabinet of millionaires who have all had a very, very similar upbringing, have no connection to this mass of ordinary people. And you think about David Cameron, Boris Johnson and George Osborne. They all went to university together and now they're running the fucking country. I mean, like, it's just madness, really. So, but we also have to say that these people do rely on all these other people for lots of things. And the army and the police are not drawn from the ruling class, apart from people like Prince Harry, who get injected in, you know, to the top of the army and very bravely go and kill people in Afghanistan. Good on him. But they are drawn from other parts of society, particularly in the army. They're drawn from working class areas. You think about where most conscripts in Britain come from, are from areas with very, very high unemployment, with very little job prospects and those kind of things. But the police are slightly different because of those antagonisms that we talked about earlier, about people not really trusting the police. They come from a slightly different layer of a society, of the kind of lower middle class. They're also bought off by higher wages, so have that different bit of distance, really. So police are not really workers in uniform. They have been bought off, and they come from a slightly different section of society. Not entirely, but generally, really. But climbing up this state hierarchy in order to end up in this little elite means that you have to convince everyone else that you're really, really loyal. So this idea that you can change the system from the inside is really ill-founded, because in order to get up to the top of this greasy pole, you have to make sure that you've elbowed other slightly softer people out of the way and have become the hardest faced capitalists that the world could ever imagine, really. And they also share the same interests. So the level of force that they use changes with the ebb and flow of class struggle, really. And struggle goes through peaks and troughs, as we said earlier. And sometimes it can be quite easy to contain one strike. One teacher's strike comes out, it doesn't really seem like it's challenging the logic of capitalism as a whole. But if you think about struggle across a whole region or a whole industry, and a long struggle of people not just being out for one day but for a number of days, it is met with greater force because and only because it poses a greater threat to the system, really. And you think about the spread of revolutions that started in Tunisia and have blossomed all across that region. They threatened ruling class after ruling class, and they responded incredibly brutally. But you also think about the response of the US in that situation, when they had to play it very carefully, when they actually had to back up Mubarak at several points during that, because if you accept that Mubarak is wrong, you also have to accept that American imperialism is wrong, and so you get this domino effect. And that's what we see in microcosm on the streets, really. But even in quieter times, the state remains that instrument of class rule, really. But in contemporary capitalism, the state does not rule by force alone. These people aren't being particularly violent right now. And so really, the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, there was a meeting about him earlier, and I recommend that people talk, get the CD. He talked about the idea of hegemony. And he developed this idea to show that the ruling class maintains intellectual and moral leadership of society through structures of civil society. And Gramsci describes civil society as being made up of institutions that we all can identify with, even though he wrote a long time ago. The churches, schools, the media, political parties, and even in some instances, trade unions. And Gramsci described them as together acting as a powerful system of fortresses and earthworks protecting capitalism. So imagine these little people around here. They've built some turrets around them, and all these things help to put out their message, to make sure that even the people on the other side of the room feel like they feel their influence, even though they've never met these people before, really. And so we're told there's no alternative, aren't we? That's what the media constantly tells us, what the government constantly tells us. We should be glad for all the lovely things that we have right now. And that anyone who tries, and that without capitalism and the order that we have now, there would be complete chaos. and also that these institutions help to maintain that point on a daily basis, not just when there's a big protest or anything like that, but on a daily basis we're told about all the things that the government and the state does very well for us, really, the whole logic of competition, we're in the free market that we're told is the only thing that keeps the world turning, really. And Gramsci said that the exercise of hegemony is characterised by the combination of force and consent, which balance each other. So while the state does have an iron fist of violence, it is cloaked in a velvet glove of freedoms and liberalism, and that's what makes up the consent. And he says that anyone challenging, anyone that's seen to be challenging the state is portrayed as being challenging liberty and freedom, whereas actually most of the time that's what they're fighting for. And the rule by consent means that workers can sometimes feel like they have a stake in society. That's part of the idea that the elections that we vote in and all those kind of things can make people feel like they have some kind of control. But again, there's those two different ideas. People think this is probably the best thing, this is what we've got right now, so we should kind of protect it. But there's also, you think about how low the turnout is in elections, that the Tories got 25% of the vote, and they talked to the teachers about the turnout of their strike vote. And now they're ruling the country. All these things are actually, as people become more disillusioned and more engaged in an alternative to the system, the adherence to the system's values gets lower, really. And then there's things like public services. You think about free education, you think about free hospitals and all those kind of things. But they are not just kind of benevolent, they're also things that keep the next generation of workers healthy and educated so that they continue, all your future generations can continue to make sure that these people have nice dinner and nice cars, really. And parliamentary democracy is a huge achievement of a movement. It is an achievement of a mass working class movement that fought the state in order to achieve real representation for ordinary men and women. But it's also something that cements the position of our rulers by giving this impression that we are under some kind of popular control, and these people are genuine representatives, even though we only vote for them once every 5 years and don't seem to listen to a word anyone says. But the system encourages us also to think of ourselves as isolated individuals. So you're not all the same people with the same interests. Instead, you're just individuals that happen to be sitting on the same room or in the same bus or working on next door desks to each other, really. And that we're locked into competition for jobs, for housing and all those kind of things, and all we can really do is fight for the best situation for ourselves and our friends and our families and hope that we don't sink, really. And these ideas also feed into the way that we work. This idea that bosses, not workers, are the ones that create the wealth in society. The people that claim off benefits are lazy, and so on. And these are reinforced by these little turrets that we have around our ruling class. But it's also because these ideas are sent to divide us. Even reactionary ideas such as racism and sexism can take hold in sections of the working class at certain times. And Marx has something really interesting to say about this, which I think is incredibly relevant. He talks about the racism of the English working class towards new Irish immigrants. And he said, this antagonism is artificially kept alive and intensified by the press, the pulpit, the comic papers, and in short, by all the means at the disposal of the ruling classes. It is a secret by which the capitalist class maintains its power, and the latter is quite aware of this. So this is something that is consciously engineered. It's not a fact of society that people are naturally racist or naturally hostile to people who don't speak their same language, but it's absolutely consciously engineered by the ruling class in order to make sure that all you people don't revolt and come and chop off their heads. So these ideas are not made up by workers, but they are taken on at certain times, really, and a divided workforce is less likely to stand together and to strike together and so on. But it's also, like we said earlier, these are not the only ideas in people's heads. What Gramsci called those things common sense, he also referred to something called good sense. These are ideas that are not only born through everyday life, but also through common struggle. And these form a different basis of understanding that some people can say, well, I think there's too much immigration. Oh, but I love the fact that I live in this area where I get to do all these things and meet all these people from other parts of the world. Our day-to-day life tells us something different. The day-to-day life of ordinary people tells us something different, really. And these are the ideas that can build solidarity, that can build resistance, and ultimately a different kind of society, really. And there are a couple of examples of this. One is in Egyptian society. In the beginning of January this year, there was a spate of quite horrific attacks on Coptic Christian churches. One was firebombed and 18 people died, and of course it hit the headlines. And this was just days, just weeks before the 25th of January revolution. And just weeks later, Muslims were linking arms around Christians praying in Tahrir Square, and then the role was reversed, and people were protecting each other while they prayed. And this is what happens when you're struggling together and when you're fighting together. People still hold on to their religious beliefs or their identity in some way, but they suddenly melt away and they no longer see the thing that we have to fight over, because we're fighting over something much more common and much bigger, really. But I don't think also you need a revolution to change people's minds about some ideas, because there are smaller examples of in struggle. In a bus garage in East London, they went on strike for a week. It doesn't seem like it. It's nothing compared to Tahrir Square, of course. But I know East London is a very culturally mixed area, and people worked together, and it wasn't that there was any particular antagonisms. But in the canteen, Bengali people ate together, and white people ate together, and Afro-Caribbean people ate together. But after that strike, the canteen looked completely different, and actually we were invited in for people who were so proud. They were kind of looking at each other like, why was this ever not like this? When it was completely mixed, and it was that idea of struggle, of having something in common, that meant that those people felt that those divisions were really no longer relevant to them and their daily lives, really. But the state obviously wants to hold on to these ideas. Those ideas of common sense are very powerful for them, and it also means that they want to have ideological hegemony. This is what ideological leadership of society. And so if they're in a very strong position, if all these things are being pushed forward and winning, the state is less likely to have to deploy what we've seen most recently, the things we've been describing, of that iron fist inside. But if, on the other hand, their hegemony is being challenged, the balance can flip the other way. And that is really what we saw during the student movement in November and December. And it wasn't particularly necessarily about the number of people, although that definitely made a huge amount of difference. But it was also about the political climate at the time. This maxim that we're all in it together, that they managed to turn around the logic of the bankers are to blame, to the benefits grants are to blame, and they thought they were on the front foot. They thought people weren't going to fight back, and that everyone thought that we had this big national credit card that needed to be cut up. But the state was completely taken by surprise when the students went, not only marched, but occupied Millbank Tower, which is the headquarters of the Tory party. And it really sent a very clear message that not only do people not agree with you and we're not all in it together, but we're going to fight tooth and nail to stop your plans from happening. But then came the backlash, didn't it? Not only were the arrests and the attacks on the demonstrations, but these televised statements of the police, the MPs, the newspapers printing the CCTV kind of stills from that the police were providing, absolutely disgusting. And most shamefully, really, even some within our movement, you think about Aaron Porter's disgraceful role, the president of the NUS, who dared to say that there's the violent minority, and absolutely joined in with that whole chorus of hostility that was coming from the media. Even the General Secretary of the UCU said we neither condone nor condemn, which is basically you're just joining in, really, with condemning these people, and had to shift, actually, because there were so many people that did stand together. And so this gives the police a get-out clause, really, doesn't it? It says these people are this violent minority, and so if we attack a demonstration, you are essentially part of this violent minority, because we've told you that anyone that protests is completely mad. We've told you that anyone who protests wants to bring down the system and make sure you lose everything that's ever precious to you. And only a minority of people demonstrate, really. But it didn't work, and actually the movement grew. On those demonstrations, they actually became more diverse. Lecturers began to join, teachers began to join, parents of school students began to join the demonstration. And really, this repression that this movement was met with really was vital for the state. The students showed that people can fight and all those kind of things. But the violence also turned many people the other way to what the police wanted. And really, they exposed themselves as a brutal part of the state and raised some people's criticisms of the system as a whole. But this process is not automatic. Neither does it necessarily lead to the conclusion that we have to defeat capitalism and all that it stands for, really. And it is shocking, and like I said at the beginning, I don't think that the reason that people get kettled for such extensive hours, I mean, I'm sure there are lots of people here that were kettled for 9 hours in what must have been minus 40, and I disagree with anyone that says it was not Arctic conditions at that time. And it does work, because it does make you think, is this going to happen to me again? What's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to my education? All those kind of things. And it can work to scare and deter people. But we don't need to be scared into silence or become fixated on the police, which I think are kind of two opposites of the same conclusion, really. We are very much uniting to defend our rights, and now it seems like every demonstration is an act of defiance. Even the smaller demonstrations that have happened, that have been met with attacks, it's like we're going to keep on doing it because that in itself is resistance, really. And it's early days, but there's the Defence of the Right to Protest campaign, which is bringing together trade unionists and lecturers and all sorts of different people, campaigning lawyers and those kind of things, that offer solidarity, that go to the courts and all those kind of things, and hold, big political meetings in order to unite people who are fighting together, that we shouldn't be saying there are peaceful, good demonstrators and then there's all these people that smash windows and there's a huge gulf between us. I think it's very important that we unite on these questions, really. But the state is constantly trying to win this argument that it's pointless, that while they like to say these people are threatening the system that we live under, they also like to say that it's pointless or counterproductive to demonstrate or to go on strike. And I think this was quite exposed. I don't know if he knows how famous he is now, because this quote has gone everywhere. But when some student protesters were up last month in Westminster, he turned to the cops representative, the prosecution, and said, when will these young people realise that they're fighting a losing battle? And really, whose benefit is that for? This case is now going to go to higher courts, and he has really no control over it. He's performing a role, he's showing his loyalty to the police and to the state, but he's also showing that he's actually quite concerned, because if they thought that it was really fruitless, then I don't really see the point of them saying it, really. And it also shows that, I think that they are quite worried, really, because in the summing up of the Gaza defendants, the case that I talked about earlier, the judge had a set statement that he read out, but just before he sent people to prison, which became quite creepy by the end of it. But it had this key sentence: protest is a hallmark of a fair society. Demonstrations can often be large and sometimes even boisterous. It's like, sometimes there's allowed to be a lot of you, and sometimes you're allowed to shout a bit. But that's basically the limit of it. That is you exercising and coming right up against your democratic rights. And after that, you've gone over to the other side, and therefore are likely to be criminalised, really. And so as this need for control intensifies, at this intensified times of class struggle, the state has to use different means to get its message across. And the suppression of political groups, for example, is one way of getting this across. Also, things like government racism and stop and search and anti-terror legislation is a way of them trying to crush parts of dissent, people that are critics of imperialism and those kind of things. And this comes out in shocking statistics. Just one is that people from ethnic backgrounds are 42 times more likely to be subject to anti-terror legislation than their white counterparts. I mean, which shows the targeted aggression of the state, really. And it's interesting to look at state repression under our new government, because we were told they were going to be the guardians of liberty and they got rid of ID cards and all of those kind of things. But there are more CCTV cameras in Britain than any other country in Europe. And also they've just continued the New Labour's dirty legacy of detention without trial and rendition flights and all of those kind of things. They talk of a small state and a big society, but when it's in their interest, they're not actually, this is not their priority at all. Their intensive monitoring of people on benefits, for example, particularly into capacity benefits, shows how their logic of the state wants to have as much control over people's lives as possible comes through. And what they mean by small state is no support, but lots of invasive operations. And when we see these things, people can be drawn to the conclusions that we live in a police state, or that's kind of where we're heading. And this argument is nothing new, and I think it's quite interesting when you look back on some of the meeting reports from the miners' strike, when people were constantly harassed and victimised, that this was a very solid argument for the first time in a generation, people considering that could be the case, really. But if you have this belief, then it can lead really to powerlessness and then to passivity. You can think that it's pointless to fight back, because ultimately either we won't win or we'll get crushed, really. And so you end up operating, instead of in a very radical way, even if you have this idea that the police are all powerful and our main task is to smash the police, you actually end up fighting in a much more conservative way. You think that we can't put the most radical demands forward, we can't demand the biggest action, because instead you think you have to do small things in small places with small groups of people in order to try and get round the state. But I'd like to say that you cannot get round the state, you have to confront it, really. That our rulers have always used this as much oppression as is necessary to defend property and the power of capital. And the very existence, really, of the police shows us that we have power. It sounds like a strange lesson from history. But the police were set up in the 1820s when there was a huge emergence of class struggle that really took hold of huge urban areas, really. And previously they had the army, which were really only trained to kill, and also, as I talked about earlier, come from a working class base and were stationed inside these areas. And so there's a huge danger that they were going to mutiny. They had this very similar interest to the people that were on strike. And so they had, and also if they started killing people, a huge insurrection, they could actually end up turning things the other way. And so the police was created as a group of bribed workers that were separated off from other groups. They had houses that were paid for by the police in different areas than the communities that they policed. And this reflected a shift in the way the state operated, but not a fundamental change in its nature, really. And when the forces of the state have been able to smash workers' organisation, the key has not been the armed power of the state, nor the technology at their disposal, really. It's been where the working class, that includes the student movement, that includes the unemployed, that includes all the other people who are fighting for rights and liberation, whether it's been united and whether it's been organised. And this is as much a case of mass movements as it is for trade unions, really. And we mentioned earlier about Aaron Porter, his effort to try and break that movement, because really he was terrified. He was terrified the demonstration was that big, that first demonstration on the 10th of November. The NUS are very proudly putting out things like, we might have 20,000 people, but don't worry, 50,000 people come onto the streets and the next demonstrations grow and grow. But Aaron Porter was very scared of that because he didn't want that to happen. And you can see sometimes, unfortunately, that mirrored in our trade union leaders, who even are, they struggle to be pushed for a one-day strike, and the idea of anything more protracted really does quite terrify them. So they end up fighting for more reformist values instead of confronting the system as a whole, really. And so really the strength that we have, not only, often we say, oh, look at Greece, and when the huge demonstrations were happening in France in 2005, but I think what happened on the 26th of March and the strikes yesterday really start to show the power that we have as ordinary people in Britain, really. And we're much bigger, and we're no match for these small section of society proportionally, or for the even smaller bodies of armed men who patrol our streets, really. And the state isn't all powerful, because while it is controlled at the top by a powerful elite, it relies on all you ordinary people to keep it going. It relies on your labour power. It relies you to keep on going to work every day. And these ordinary people, I think, are becoming ever more critical of the system. And the fact that the strike happened yesterday and the other huge condemnation of the government, I think, has been absolutely significant in showing that kind of change, really. And at times of crisis, the ideological coherence of the ruling class becomes ever more threatened. You think about all the U-turns that the government has made, desperately trying to maintain its hold over the coalition, but at the same time knowing that people are becoming ever more angry. And these cracks can start to make a space where the left can put through its ideas. It also means that in a revolutionary situation, the ruling class cannot necessarily rely on the army or even sections of the police to put through its orders. And we've seen many mutinies throughout history. And we have to understand the state isn't all powerful, because for me it's critical to have that understanding in order to show that we can fight back. The state is always a tool of class oppression, and it's crucial to say that why in a revolution we would have to break the state, the power of the state, in order to create a new society that in no way represents the one that we live in now. And the reality is that the ruling class are scared of every movement and every strike because it damages their power. So for me, and I hope for all of you here, it's both possible and necessary for us to resist. Thanks, everybody. I think it was a really interesting discussion. I think it shows the variety of experiences that people currently have, really. I like, someone talked about guidelines and about things that are within their guidelines, but really their guidelines just shift and change as much as they want them to, so it just becomes legitimate. They can say, we now need to do this, or we'll just write it, or just add it to the back page of this book. Okay, so now you can do this, And you think about after the student demonstration, they were started doing, well, we're going to think about water cannons and all those kind of things. It wasn't that there was a law passed to make it okay, it was just that they, should the time come, they would have a little chat with Theresa May, and and then that would be possible, So I think, although I think it's important and we can use the law for our side, I think people like campaigning lawyers like Matt, who is speaking on Sunday, who I really recommend that people go and see, who fight people's cases and absolutely defend the right for people to protest. Also, that the law isn't on our side and it is made by people, these little people, sorry to keep on victimising you, who have got those same interests. So I think it's important that we see all those things together, really. And that's the same with the courts and the police, because really they are two of the most important things that make up the nature of the state, and you cannot separate one thing from another, as the last speaker said, really. And I'd like to take on some of the arguments about Leicester. I was on that demonstration as well. And it's true that on that demonstration, the police built lots of lines in the city centre and all those kind of things. They also let fascists into the city centre, number one. They also let fascists walk around the city centre. I walked past pubs where they were drinking from 10 o'clock in the morning. And yeah, they didn't attack us on that day, but then you go to Bolton, rewind to Bolton last year, where the police made a concrete effort to smash apart a demonstration, to send in snatch squads time and time and time again, indiscriminate of age or gender or anything else, and people got very, very badly hurt. We ended up not actually protecting our demonstration against the EDL, we ended up protecting our demonstration from the police, and that was a really, really hard thing to learn. But the reality is that the thing that makes us strong, that makes all you people strong, is our numbers, and that is the same case for anti-fascism, it's the same case for fighting the cuts, it's the same case for strikes, that we don't need the police to defend us, we defend ourselves. And as the person said, the police actually don't give a crap about ordinary people and their houses and their crime. People called and they've had their houses burgled and a cop turns up 3 days later. Like, they don't actually care about us at all. And so really we have to find ways of defending ourselves, and I would like to say that's it very much in terms of organisation and in terms of number, really. And I think the role of the media has been absolutely disgraceful, and I think the role of progressive journalism is very, very important, because it does help to cut across some of those things, and the exposure of the undercover cops and the exposure of the war on terror and rendition and all those kind of things do help to make big dents in those things. But just having good media isn't a solution, because we also have to tackle that thing that's at our core, really. I would like to say several things. I will mind my language. First of all, I think in Grosvenor Square, I mean, you can look on any footage, and the attacks on people were just absolutely brutal. Yeah, they were armed with sticks. They were on horses, hitting people over the head with sticks. And I don't feel sorry that they had shorter sticks then and have longer sticks now. The state is absolutely a totality of the judiciary, and the state has constantly been brutal. I'd like to also say something about Jodie's case as well, this idea that how come there isn't a case. Well, Jodie's case was brought to the IPCC, the so-called Independent Police Complaints Commission, which was taken off the net because there was so much blatant corruption that even the government thought, best tone this down a bit. So now we have the IPCC. And it was the IPCC supervised the Metropolitan Police Inquiry that helpfully absolved themselves. And Jodie is now going to have to spend his own money seeking legal aid, which is now being cut, let's not forget, to go and take these things to the courts, because the things that are supposed to be there for ordinary people to be able to bring these things about, to be able to hold the police to account, are no longer there for people. So it's not like Jodie hasn't fought his case. The fact is the state has attacked him and has then covered it up. And the only really police that I admire are the people that were mentioned in the last meeting. The one cop who's seen on footage laying down his shield, laying down his bat and putting his hands up and walk away. And people that take pensions after spending years attacking people on demonstrations and policing working class communities, I don't really have much time for, really. The army and the police, the role of the army and the police, I think is quite interesting, because people are talking about mutinies, and really most of the time mutinies do happen from the army. The Iranian Revolution, for example, and even Egypt, is actually quite a strong indicator of where those dynamics are. The army are much more often from those ordinary backgrounds. People talked about loads of people from their areas joining the army but not joining the police, and that's why the break will most frequently come from the army and not from the police. And the fact is that what happened in Egypt was the police didn't join, they ran. And that's the dynamic that we have to create, and I think that's through numbers, that's through unity. But I would like to say it's also through organisation and being a revolutionary.